Yes, we're ready to go.
You want me to show my screen, or I thought you were going to do the introduction? Oh, I show my screen and then.
Yes, please.
Okay, ready?
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining I-Corps' October webinar, Preserving, Protecting, and Recovering Data. My name is Tiffany Collins. I'm the Program Director for I-Corps, here to introduce our presenter, Brian Price. Brian is the Vice President of Engineering and Training at Jones Lang LaSalle. He is responsible for communications and training associated with the JLL systems used by JAL, its clients, its service provider partners for the provision of real estate services, including engineering, facility management, and project management. Welcome, Brian, and thank you for your time today.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, so today's webinar is around preserving, protecting, and recovering data. And you can see our objectives there on the screen, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to go through and understand the current trends in the IT industry. We're going to explore some challenges in the IT industry around, preserving, protecting, and recovering of data. And then we want to understand how all those challenges are going to be met, when we look at from a business perspective and, of course, looking at our IT priorities. And then we want to describe our general design principles in the IT continuity and the IT disaster recovery. Now, throughout this presentation, if you do happen to have questions, please use the question tool as part of the webinar. And then we'll go through those as we go. We can either do them on the fly, either or. If you have a question you'd like answered right away, just please indicate that. And just so you know, there will be polls as well. So as we go through the presentation, you'll see these polls come up, and just use the tools to interact and give your answer or your selection as part of the polls. So as we'll just get going. So these are our objectives, and we'll go through the slides and talk about each one of these objectives. Okay, so the first one, we want to understand the current trends in the IT industry. Understanding where we are and what the trends are is going to help us understand what's available and how we need to adapt and move towards the new future of IT. So obviously, green IT, you hear this term quite often, being green. And of course, there's lots of certifications around those, like LEED, Green Globes, that kind of thing for buildings. Understanding, what is it and how do we get there? We want to reduce and use hazardous materials, maximize energy efficiency. Of course, we want to recycle and reuse as much as possible. Anything that we, defunct products, in other words, things that we've used already, factory waste, that kind of thing. Being green just means reusing that as much as possible. And IT has a lot of waste, and we want to recycle as much as possible. It's not just the cardboard that it comes in, it's also the servers, anything we can use. And then, of course, our commoditization, right? Servers, storage, and other components, they're going to have interchangeable parts. And if you look at the big players in the IT industry, you'll notice that a lot of them use very similar products throughout their organization. And this, of course, gives them better pricing, and of course, we don't have to make a whole lot of changes. You have a software package that goes with it. It makes it much more easy to program, and you get better functionality and everything out of your resources if you have a lot of consistent interchangeable parts. And this does include things like software as well, right? Having multiple sources, a lot of times having different places you can get that from is also very important, and part of the new way that IT is trying to adapt and evolve. Okay, being mobile, right? Big part of today's industry, and of course, being able to use your mobile device to interact with your data, right? And the IT industry in general, using that wireless technology to communicate back and forth, right? Is going to require some kind of protocol, some kind of a software for you to do that. And so, being able to perform business transactions from those devices, from anywhere and any time, right, it's going to require some kind of a connectivity, and of course, being able to prevent those people trying to get into your stuff and mess around, right, either on purpose or on accident, is something that's part of that, right? So being able to understand what mobile devices they're using, you are using in your organization, and how you're letting people in. Big part of the changes around IT. Go back 20 years, right? There wasn't a whole lot of people, logging in with mobile devices. Nowadays, pretty much everybody is using it. So, and then virtualization, right? Basically decoupling from having physical hardware, physical servers, and essentially creating multiple servers on multiple device, from a big computing, right? Virtualizing it versus having physical hardware for each different server. Right, it is a big change, and we're moving away from having one server performing one action to having large virtual devices that are capable of doing a whole lot more. And they're much greater for resource utilization, and of course they're much more flexible because we can do a whole lot more with that. Okay, so once you've got all this data, you got to store it, consolidate it, and of course there's cloud computing is also there. So some consolidation ideas around IT, right? Optimizing your server storage technologies. We want to achieve cost savings with that, right? Because obviously if you take your data, put it in one storage location, right, it's a whole lot easier than it is if you have it pocketed all over the place, right? So you can get better cost savings, improve performance, and of course you can mitigate the risk a lot easier if it's in one place, rather than storing it in multiple locations all throughout. Now, sometimes it's unavoidable that you have different data, but where it is possible to consolidate, that's what we're talking about. You've got one large bucket of data that's doing the same thing, consolidate that as much as possible. It makes it a whole lot easier, and you get better performance. And then there's cloud computing. The idea around cloud computing is that we provide a service over the internet that's going to use that hardware, and you host it through this cloud computing managed service, right? Essentially, you take and you use that cloud computing to enhance all the different devices. You can see everything from servers to laptops to your mobile devices, and be able to use all from the same different cloud computing location. Okay, big data needs to be resilient, and of course the trend in IT has been moving consistently forward towards becoming more and more resilient. And so obviously you want your data to be as resilient as possible, right? We've got a lot of data, and if you look back, data has grown so much. I mean, back in the day, gigabyte was a lot. Nowadays, people have multiple gigabytes on their person at any given time. So big data is changing. It's becoming bigger and bigger, right? So we've got high volume, high velocity, transferring that data at a very, very large rate. And we've got a variety of data as well. So you've got to enhance the processing to be able to look at that decision making, look at the different discoveries, and of course optimize your processing of that data as well, right? And this is a huge, huge challenge as data keeps getting bigger and bigger, and we want the data to be available all the time, right? So very, very hard to have that data available when it's so much data, and you've got to process it almost immediately. Otherwise, you got the data unavailable, right? Or not in the right state that it needs to be in. And then, of course, resiliency. And resiliency, there's a million different aspects to resiliency. And being able to understand how you're being resilient, right? It's not just backing up the data or having different multiple processes doing the same thing. It's more about making sure that the components, the entire critical environment, right, is able to recover and continue operating even if an outage or disruption actually occurs. Right? So being resilient has so many different aspects, and getting there requires a whole lot. And of course, in IT, an outage can cost a whole lot of money and a whole lot of loss of face, so to speak. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. Right? So being resilient is definitely the way to go from an IT perspective, and it's getting more and more requirement. Right? Even small outages, look at things like airlines that have an outage of their data, right, causing their flights to be delayed. Right? These kind of things can cost a company much more than just dollars, right? So resiliency can make a huge difference in that from that perspective alone. Here we have our first poll. I'm going to pass over to Tiffany.
So the poll is launched. Which trend is the biggest challenge to meet for your organization? Okay, we have 25. Everyone is chiming in here, Brian.
Yeah, I see that. So we've got 67% voted so far. We'll give it a second or two.
Okay.
%75, getting closer. I think we give it like maybe 45 seconds or so.
Okay.
Got 75% people voted so far. It looks like big data and resiliency is the winner on this particular poll. So we had 50%. So you're showing the results, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. You're so
50% with big data and resiliency. 22% with storage, consolidation, and cloud computing. And the last two, mobility and virtualization at 17%, and green IT with 11%. Wow.
yeah. So obviously, big data resiliency is very important, obviously, and of course, as we talk through this slide deck, we're going to definitely spend a lot of time on the resiliency aspect and how you get there. You know, the trends of the IT industry around that. Okay. So first, before we get into all the different things, we want to talk about the challenges from the perspective of IT, because understanding the challenges is going to be really important when we talk about how we're going to get there and what tools we're going to need to get us to meet the challenge, right? To meet the challenge. So we've got some operational challenges around the IT infrastructure. The first is around silos, right? So you've got a lot of different choices for silos, and of course, every time you make a different choice, those different solutions are going to require different aspects of, how do you mount it, how do you connect to it, what does the physical device look like, how much cooling, all that stuff really plays into it. And of course, you need to understand that every one of those is going to require that the challenge be met, right? And you want it to be available, so you certainly don't want the cooling going out, you don't want the power going out. You want to be able to support the many tools that are going to be implemented, software, IT infrastructure. It's all going to be part of the challenge. So we need to understand that as one of the biggest challenges, is understanding that infrastructure and how we're going to meet that challenge. And then, of course, visibility, right? We need that software and performance. We need to track how well is it doing, right? Is the processing power of the IT infrastructure sufficient enough to run that? So you need to be able to see how is it running? Is it running slow? Are we having data issues, right? Especially being able to look at the data. And this is something, if you think about from the perspective of your search engine, right, you want to be able to mine the data, right, no matter how big the data is, be able to mine it, look at it, pull back results, and understand exactly, what do you have, right? So you want visibility, clear visibility to your IT. And then, of course, automation. Now, automation, you want to make sure not too many routine processes, right? The routine processes could be simple as going through and doing a data check and doing data sort, right? And these kind of things. You don't want that pulling too much of your data, you don't want too much of your processing power being used for automation, right? You want to make sure that shortage of time for value add activities, so you can add processes to that and everything runs smooth. And that's kind of the key. It's a huge challenge to know how much you can do and how much you should, how do you keep it nice and smooth and clean, okay? And then, of course, productivity. Now, this is the key, right? This is what your IT is meant to do, make your organization more productive, right? And you need to be able to enhance that end user activity. Now, this is what the key of your IT is in the first place, right? This is why you have it. You want to be productive. So you don't want the automation bogging it down. You want to be able to see your data. You want to have the infrastructure in place. And that's all going to play into your productivity. And of course, supporting new devices and systems as they come out, right, is going to be key. And it's going to feed back through all of the other parts, right? Your silos, your visibility and automation, as your new devices and support of those new devices changes, right? It's going to require new software and new hardware, right? And everything needs to have visibility and automation built into it. So big challenge, right? So as we grow, as things change, we realize, hey, we need new software, we need new hardware, that kind of thing. Well, obviously, it's going to cost something, right? So we got to worry about our budget constraints, right? Uncertain economy, organizations want to make the most of what you got, right? So you can't just be spending money willy-nilly, right? It's got to be smart, right? Smart budget spends, right? Smart money. Make sure you don't overcommit to certain applications, certain software, and make sure that you have a good investment in the new technology as it grows and becomes available. Right? So you want to make sure that the budget is very controlled and you understand exactly what you have so that you can move forward with that. Okay, and then of course complexity sprawl, right? Technology is getting more and more complex, so we need to understand what's available, right? What can we use, right? What can make our IT infrastructure even better, right? By understanding and adding those technologies as they become available, right? And then just making sure that as that complexity increases, that we have the talent to be able to go through and understand, what is it that we're doing, empower the end user to use those tools as well, right? So that requires some measure of training, right? Some measure of actually going through the infrastructure, making sure from every aspect of it that we have that training in place, have the people and the talent so that we get the right tools and the right equipment used. Okay, and then you got your availability, right? Companies need to ensure your employees get to the data easy, right? This includes everything from, having your phone, right, being able to access the data, access the tools that you need, or your laptop, or whatever tool they plan on using it, right? Making sure that the availability is there and that they can get to their data easily, right? And it doesn't matter how it's stored or how old the data is, right? Just making sure as you grow, as the IT complexity changes, right, that we have that ability, okay? And of course, integrity. Now, integrity has measures of security, has measures of just making sure that you don't have the wrong person in place. So it's a training aspect as well, right? Because anybody that has access might accidentally, right, without the proper training, delete data that's important, change data that's important. So for integrity concerns, you need to be able to trust that whatever you're storing remains intact and unaltered. Right? Nobody's changing it, and you're able to get to it, and things look good, right? Especially when it involves things like sales, marketing, and your big important aspects of your budget. Okay, all these different things, the data becomes really critical to your operational aspects, and so making sure that the data doesn't get changed or altered is going to be very important, right? So security first, and then of course training and making sure that nobody's going to mess the data up. Okay, so complexity is a big problem, right? As we get more and more complex, understanding, how are we actually going to keep the data, right? What kind of infrastructure are we going to use, right? So understanding one of the challenges, how complex do you need to be, and if you are going to be complex, how is it going to work? So you've got a multi-tiered heterogeneous environment. You've got a legacy application that are going to feed into this, right? These typically, legacy applications tend to be not complex, but the complexity gets involved when you try to integrate that into your new infrastructure. Right? It can be very complex having software that actually interacts correctly with legacy applications. Okay, look at the different platforms, and sometimes new platforms start fire up, and you got to be able to interact with those as well. But then you've got your old legacy platforms as well. Windows, Apple, iOS. And you've got different devices as well, right? Your laptop, your desktop, your server, and as well as your phone. And you have to be able to mix and match all those different complex technologies as they change and evolve, right? And you add security. And that's one of the hardest things. Updates throughout the system. One update to an OS can affect all of your different systems connected to that OS. Right? And it's just a huge challenge to be able to get there. Okay. Virtualization is also a big challenge as you move everything from having a physical device to having a virtual device, that you actually have to understand the protocols and the connectivity with that virtual device, and how do you connect to it. Okay, all those different variables, being able to balance them correctly within the organization, right? Again, all those different challenges and complexities, right, require a balance of all the different variables associated with it. Okay, you got a variety of deployment modules, and we see kind of a layout of a data center or infrastructure with lots of servers, right? Depending on your organization, depending on what your needs of the organization is going to depend on how complex and how many different models you might need to get where you need to go with your IT infrastructure. Okay, and then of course failures. And we talked about some examples of an expensive failure, but every organization, right, we want to avoid failures, right? I don't think there's an organization out there that likes failures. So avoiding failures is a big thing, right? And of course, they get more and more complex the more the organization gets complex. So obviously, a failure becomes really, really hard to recover from, and also very expensive. So compliance, right? So compliance is all about understanding what rules and regulations are around for that particular aspect. And of course, you see we've got security, right? And the security is constantly changing because obviously the I don't know, what do you call them, the hackers or the individuals that are trying to get into our IT infrastructure are getting smarter, and they're using different tools, and they're always trying to find a way around the current security measures. So as we look at security, there are compliance requirements and risks associated with it. Obviously, understanding what the regulatory requirements are around security is very important, but also understanding what are your risks, right? So if I don't upgrade, right, if I don't make the changes, what are the risks to my organization? What is the risk to my data? And understanding, compliance is important, but also understanding what risks are associated is just as important. Okay. Now we want our data to become available, right? And it's always available. However, any availability associates to a risk. I'll give an example. When you give a vendor access to your data to perform an action, right? And this may be a service that's provided from that vendor, right? That is a risk, right? Giving them access to the data allows them to go in, modify the data, make changes, but it also gives them that login, right? Once they have a login, then they need to make sure they understand the controls and the security requirements around it as well, right? So yes, we need to make the data available. However, right, we need to make sure that to avoid those risks, how are we going to, keep that data safe, right? So big challenge there, right? Big challenge. A lot of organizations are writing a lot of policies and requirements around that, right? Like a simple policy stating if we're going to give access to a vendor, that they must be on site or something like this. A lot of remote access used to be the way of the past. Well, that's shifting, right? It's shifting to where they might have to actually physically be on site or be at the server to perform changes. Right? That day of free access and free availability, right? It's kind of a huge risk, and we want to do as much as we possibly can to avoid it. So big challenge there. Performance, right? Performance being a challenge. As we get into the future, our devices, everybody wants everything now, right? It's like immediate performance has to be top-notch. And if somebody tries to go to your website, tries to go to your IT and log into the server and get the data and perform some action, the worst thing to happen, right, is have them to go out, look at the data, and they can't get to it, right? Or it's just taken too long. And I see that this can actually cause a huge amount of frustration, and people might just give up, right? And that that lack of performance on the system end, right, can have a huge impact on not only the reputation of the organization, but also the ability of your individuals to perform work, right? They have to be able to get in there, get things done, and if the performance of the system is not allowing it, right, it's a huge challenge, right? Huge challenge. You make upgrades, you make changes, system gets more complex. That can have a huge impact on your IT performance. So we need to monitor that, right? As we talked about before, monitoring is a big part of this, right? Make sure things don't change. And of course, compliance. This goes with security, availability, performance, right? Everything really has a compliance aspect to it, right? There could be a regulation or a control around it, right? And making sure we understand, what is actually required regulation and what is just the best practice, right? So, there's so many different compliance aspects to this, right? Including obviously security, availability, making sure we understand what's the best practice as well. Right, and so we can make sure we are compliant and that we're not adding risk to our organization. Okay, so another big challenge around efficiency. Now, we need to reduce the complexity of our systems, right, because it makes it a whole lot easier from the perspective of operational, right, by consolidating and standardizing your middleware, right? So all the different applications and making sure that, remember we started out by talking about making sure that they're a lot of the same, right, and lots of different places where you can get that as well, right? So lots of different suppliers, little systems, networks, databases. You want to reduce the complexity, and make sure that everything is going to function correctly, and it's not going to go down, and you're not going to be able to find the parts and that kind of thing. So one of those big challenges, one of the big aspects of that challenge is being able to actually find that product, right? And if it gets old and outdated, right, the support starts to get old and outdated. So this is, upgrades and making sure you're adapting and evolving, right? It's a big challenge, and it's a big part of where IT is going, right? Older legacy systems used to be common to find out there. It's not really the way business should be run today, right? Newer, better software, better operating systems, right? And consolidating, making sure that they all work. Okay. We want to also have the placement and connectivity of those services so that they are in, general location where they are, the connectivity to that location as well, right? And it's going to affect your performance and availability big time. And this is also a big part of, for instance, if you're outsourcing your data, right, you check the connectivity of whatever supplier you're looking at, right? See what kind of throughput you're getting to that data center, to that location, to make sure that your service is going to be good. It's the same thing here, right? We want to make sure before we ever do that, right, that big challenge is making sure we do have that connectivity. We're not going to have a performance issue, and we're not going to have availability of that service affected by the connectivity. Okay, and then of course automating the IT processes is going to make a huge difference, right? Having those processes actually operate on their own without requiring any manual interaction, right? You don't want somebody to have to go in there and make changes or push a button or that kind of thing. You automate it, right? So when things do go wrong, right, we're able to have the system react and fix it versus having us actually manually have to go in and make changes. Okay, we're at our second poll. Tiffany?
Okay, Brian, which challenge is the most challenging to deal with at your organization? We're launching that one. Operational challenges, growth, complexity, compliance and risks, efficiency.
Okay, and I'm just browsing at the percentage. So 25, 36, 39, okay, getting there. 54, pretty good. So I'm seeing complexity starting as the leader of the pack there. Almost 70%.
There's a three-way tie here.
I don't know, complexity is leading. I see that as 45% so far.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we got about 50 seconds in, so we got 71%, and you can share the results? Or did you share?
Yep.
Oh, you would share. Okay. So complexity is the leader there, and of course challenging, meaning your organization is dealing with all those different issues with complexity. And of course, as systems get more and more complex, as we have different operating systems, right? Different things that keep. Look at that, nice. Have you, obviously, operational challenges coming in second. So operational challenges, of course, really does feed a lot into complexity as well. But when you deal with the operation of your, your IT infrastructure and everything, I think I feel that there's a lot of getting the right people and the right training and all that stuff, as well as budget feeds into that one. Right? And those are big challenges. But then you got to deal with, when they get complex, then you need more and more training, right? It's just very challenging. So, all right, good poll. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to get into the addressing of IT risk and, of course, the continuity and technology recovery. Okay, so when you have a business continuity aspect of your building, and of course everyone does, you want to make sure your business stays operational, stays as best, continuity is all about that, right? Making sure that you don't lose any aspect of your business, you stay regulatory, you stay within the requirements, and everything's up and running, and you're making money, of course. And of course, getting there is going to require some measure of resiliency. So as things change, right, we look at the future, right, and this is going from the past, the way things used to be on the left-hand side of the screen, and we're moving towards the right side of the screen, and this is going to make our business continuity more resilient. This is the way that things are changing, right? The business is changing, right? We're going from manual processes. We're responding to that by saying, okay, we really don't like manual responses. We would rather have an automated response that's integrated into the system so that it automatically happens, right? Makes a lot more sense, right? Having somebody manually react to that also requires headcount, and that can affect your, IT, especially if it's 24/7. Right, and that's a big change, right? That's a big change to the way things were done. Long-term, right? Long-term business continuity. Now everything is got to have it now, right? Short-term, we don't want anything taking forever. If we submit a request, that kind of thing, the duration needs to be shorter, right? We want the duration to be much shorter. Okay, and of course, before, we used to have the environment, used to be a lot of shared data and all that. Now we've got a lot more dedicated, right? Dedicated, and the systems are dedicated to a specific process, specific thing. Okay, and that's not to say virtualization. That's to say the actual dedicated process. Okay, and then when we look at before, we had a lot of degraded performance when things changed. That was pretty common back in the day. If you had degraded service, you might go and do something else or whatever, and wait for that service to become available. Nowadays, you really want the service level not to change, right? You don't want it to go from a very low service level to a very high service level. Now, this also plays right into things like peak demand, right, where you've got a lot of and I use this for example. If you go to like a major store, like if you have Costco in your area, I see this all the time, and they have those peak demand times. And they know as an organization when that peak demand occurs. And you think, you walk in, you go, oh, I'm just going to run into these huge lines because there's so many people here. You walk up to the front and the lines seem to be exactly the same size no matter what time you walk into the store. I always thought that was a little unusual because there's times when I'd walk into the store and there's nobody else there, right? And the line is just as long as if there was hundreds and hundreds of people. So it's all about making the service level equivalent, right? So you're waiting in line exactly the same amount of time no matter when you show up. And that's from every aspect of IT. It's the same logic. You don't want somebody going to your website, on Black Friday or IT Monday, whichever one, and having that service level change. You want to have the peak demand or extra servers or extra computing power or extra processing at those peak demand times. Okay, so you want to make sure your data is current. There used to be a time of backup where you would actually back up at a specific time. Nowadays, you just want to make sure that at the point of interruption that you have the data is backed up and recovered. Okay, and of course, base images, whenever you do a recover and roll forward, right now it's every time you restart, you go do a base image. and of course lengthy, or you want the restoration to be fast, right? So obviously it used to take forever to come back up after an outage. Right? Nowadays, if you have an outage, even at the data center level, the outage time is traditionally very, very fast, especially if the system protocols are followed and of course the procedures are followed. I mentioned before that they had that IT outage that caused the issue with the airline. The main problem, or the main issue that happened there, was that the policies and procedures weren't followed. And when that happens, you go from this fast recovery time or fast restoration time to all of a sudden lengthy, right? And that was a manual interaction that caused that. It wasn't automated. Right? The automated system would have worked perfectly if the manual interaction had been correct. So finding those risks, finding those issues is going to be a big challenge, and it's something that we need to be able to do. Okay, so disaster recovery, right? How are we going to recover when things go wrong, right? So there is automated disaster recovery, whereas essentially you mirror or replicate the data from a primary site to a secondary site. You can have multiple applications, right, feeding in from the primary site to the secondary site. So they detect the failure, the site starts up, the application data recovery, and the infrastructure changes to meet the demand. Okay. We also want to look at preventing downtime as part of our disaster recovery program. Of course, downtime can be avoided by simulating, right, doing simulations of a disruption and seeing how the system reacts, how quickly it reacts, right, that disaster recovery. We can also do health checks of the system, verifying that we don't have a disaster about ready to occur, and do some non-disruptive DR testing, which can be anything from software application testing to going down to the IT infrastructure and verifying that everything is connected properly, right? These kind of things are non-disruptive, however, very important to make sure that when we do have downtime that we can reduce that period of time that it's actually down. And of course, we want to manage our dependencies, right? Everything from data center down to the web applications to the database, failure over of the entire service, right? Manage those physical and virtual mix, right? How are they all mixed? And of course, reducing the reliance on your personal and custom scripts, right? So this includes anything from software down to any kind of personally designed web application. If you've got a piece of script in there, a piece of programming, right, it's a whole lot better to go with a piece of program that's proven and verified to work than custom or making a personal script, right, as part of it, because those tend to be where the issues start arriving, right? And then of course when you go in and you look at that script, it could very well cause the entire system outage if not perfect. Okay, so when you have a strategy for disaster recovery and you're implementing it, first thing you got to plan, right? So you look at your business impact, right? You look at your business overall, your model. Make sure that you don't, whatever business impact you can accept is acceptable, right? You make sure you understand what that is, right? Analyze it and plan for it, okay? Look at your recovery objectives, right? RPO and RTO. How much time, what kind of recovery do you need, right? And look at the objectives of that recovery as they pertain to the plan. Right? And then, of course, look at the application availability and data availability, right? Data and applications are, there's the whole tamale for your disaster recovery. If you can get the applications up and running, you get the data available, right? Being able to plan for those and being able to plan for how are you going to recover, right? Big part of the plan. And then you get into the deployment of that strategy. Right? Deploy your disaster recovery solution. Now, this may require a software purchase, a hardware purchase. It could require that you have a service come in and be part of it. Right? But whatever that is, you need to deploy it, and of course, you need to back it up. Right? Back it up with some kind of, even if it's an outside organization, make sure that you have the right contract in place. Right? Make sure that the service delivery is where you want it to be. Right? Deploy the right strategy for your plan. It's got to meet your plan. Okay, and then initiate your data disaster protection. So at some point, you've got to deploy your solution. Getting some background noise. Is that you, Tiffany? Okay. So you want to initiate disaster protection. So initiate your DR solution, right? Make sure that it's going to meet. And of course, after you get everything deployed, you need to assess whether it's going to meet your demand. So monitor the health of your DR sites. Make sure that everything's up and running. And this includes everything from the application to the hardware level, right? Verifying that everything's connected properly. And of course, if you're backing up data and providing that kind of solution, right, verify that it looks healthy, right, and test it, right? Do an assessment and an audit of your disaster recovery. So, and this could involve having a mock-up or a system application that does that test for you. And a lot of times organizations will send a team out, right, and actually test to see if the team performs well as the disaster recovery event occurs, right? So they understand exactly what is the process, especially for a large IT infrastructure, right? Verifying that they understand what they're supposed to do and that they're going to perform their actions correctly. Okay, some big challenges. The first is detecting when you have a problem, right? Obviously, very, very difficult for these problems to be detected sometimes. A lot of times, in the worst case scenarios, you have an end user is telling you you've got a problem. Best case scenario is your system lets you know and corrects it automatically before it impacts an end user, right? That's the best solution for disaster recovery. If you wait and let the end user discover it, you may have multiple end users by the time you've discovered exactly what the problem is and had a chance to react to it, right, to fix it. So look at that system, look at the problem. Are you able to detect it, right? Looking at things like system upgrades, right? They are the leading cause of downtime. 72% of potential problems are not really obvious, right? So the worst thing, obviously, end user finds it. Best thing is you find out, before you perform the system upgrade, right, well, how is this going to impact my system? Now, it's really hard to figure out exactly how it's going to impact, right? But do some research, do some study, make sure that before you do an upgrade, right, and have it done by a professional service if that's needed. Okay, testing. When you test your disaster recovery, it can be very, very, very expensive, especially if you have to send an off-site team off to be trained. And of course, you look at large enterprises, right? DR tests can be very disruptive. See, 24% say your disaster recovery test impacted your revenue, right? So we definitely don't want disaster recovery testing to be impacting the organization. And 59% say the disaster recovery tests disrupt the employees, right? So 60% say that the DR tests are, so likely if your DR tests are going to be disrupting your overall system, that's obviously maybe look into how to perform testing without interrupting your employees or your revenue. Obviously, it's very difficult to come up with all solutions, but look and see what you can find out. Lots of different ideas there. So testing is infrequent and results are subpar. Okay, you want to make sure if you are going to test your disaster recovery systems that testing is effective, right? And you don't want any subpar results. If you do, then obviously it's time to implement a change. Right? So implement a change of your disaster recovery. Go back, do that planning stage again, right? And then if you need to adjust your disaster recovery plan, then make sure that you go back through and actually change how you're implementing your disaster recovery. 20% of large enterprises test less than once a year, and nearly a third of those tests fail. If a third of the tests are failing and only 20% are actually testing, you're likely to have a big problem when you need that DR system to work, right? So, right, making sure that you are doing the testing is a key part, and when you actually do that testing, if you have a failure, go back through, replan it, re-implement your disaster recovery so that it is going to be effective. Okay, automation, right? And we've said the best solution for disaster recovery is that the system finds the problem and corrects it before it affects an end user. So automatic detection and notification, right? Very key part of disaster recovery, right? It's going to help you reduce your downtime. It can actually eliminate downtime if found and corrected before an end user impact. So automated application brings up the problem, configures recovery tasks so that you can actually recover, right? Recover quickly, right? And be smart about it, okay? Reduce the complexity of it. You don't want it to be too complex and take too long, right? So when you have a failover and a failback, right, plan, disaster recovery, whatever it is, right, make sure that it's not too complex to get that fixed, right? Single GUI for all disaster recovery needs, okay? And of course have a physical, virtual mix and multi-tier application disaster recovery. So every aspect of your system, right, is going to be tested properly for your disaster recovery. So if you've got physical devices, virtual devices, or a mix, a multi-tier application for your disaster recovery, make sure all those aspects are part of your disaster. I mean, don't just do a disaster recovery from the application side or from the server side or from a single data center side, right? It needs to incorporate all aspects of your IT. And of course your costs, right? 24/7 monitoring with no manual interventions, probably one of the cheapest ways to go, right? Having the system actually correcting problems on its own. Now some systems it's not possible, obviously. When you get physical devices involved, it's going to require some measure of physical interaction, either turning the power back on or checking what's going on with the air conditioning. You know, there's going to be some kind of interaction, right? And from the IT side, a lot of times applications go down, might require a reboot. It might require a physical person to go out into the IT space and restart that, right? Look at having a physical person available, or if you've got vendors, right, look at vendor lock-in, right, support for most solutions, right? Make sure that they're available to support whatever you need a vendor for, right? And then, of course, having a contract in place is going to make it a whole lot cheaper, right, rather than having to call them out every time there's a problem. Okay, and then, of course, automated infrastructure, reducing labor costs for the infrastructure as well. Again, there can be some challenges there, right? It can be very complex. Having that automated feature, if it works, is great, right? The problem with automated features, if they don't work and you start having issues, yeah, you can reduce the labor costs on the front end, but getting it set up and getting it, you know, you have to do a cost balance analysis, right? Is it going to be cost effective to do it that way, or is it just too complex? Okay. So when you look at virtualized environments, how are you going to perform that disaster recovery is key. Now this is all part of the plan we talked about before, and then of course when we implement a disaster recovery solution, right, looking at the type of disaster recovery you've got is important. So you've got a virtual to virtual application failover. If you look at the way that typically is, you can set it up, have a production site and a disaster recovery site. And essentially the application could be running on both these sites, right? You have them both running at the VM and production sites, okay? Excuse me, the production and the disaster recovery. So you have that application running, and then the data is replicated, okay? So if you switch over from one to the other, the data is the same, right? And then of course you have a global cluster between the VM pairs. So this is a good way to get an application to fail over from one to the other. So that failure shouldn't affect the end user, or if it does affect them, it's a short period outage. Okay. Then you've got a physical to and from the virtual application failover, where you've got the application running on a physical server and at production, right? And then of course you have a DR target for the application hosted at your VM, right? Same OS, right? Same operating system, so that when they do fail over, they're able to communicate properly. And then, of course, you're going to have to form that global cluster between the physical server and the VM, right, the virtual machine. Okay, and then, of course, when you have virtual machine failover, you're going to have the machine itself fail over the entire virtual machine as part of the DR. So you're going to have basically the same boot image replicated between both sites. So you're going to have this entire virtual machine, right, replicated on a disaster recovery site, another virtual machine. And of course, the boot image is replicated, automated configuration, and of course, you need Solaris zones, LDOM, different application support for that disaster recovery between production and the disaster recovery sites. Okay, when you look at the failover choices, right, application as a unit, if you look at the different choices, the application between virtual machines has to be the same. So between production and disaster recovery, okay? Virtual to physical disaster recovery and vice versa, okay? And then, of course, you make sure you got the proper support for that application. And then if you look at the machine of the disaster recovery failover, global failover, can't speak, global failover of virtual machine, okay? And of course, if you look at the overall production site versus disaster recovery site, looking at those images, of course, they have to be the same, okay? Make sure that you update the virtual machine during that failover. Anytime there's an update, make sure both machines have the same image. And of course, it has to support the VMware and the different applications as well. Okay, apparently, okay, there's some arrows going. Okay, so we look at the software for disaster recovery, right? There's some management software that you're going to have to go with something, right? Something that's going to perform that disaster recovery, and it's going to manage it for you. Okay, this is part of that when you plan it out, picking which software, which standard type of software you're going to use. It's going to be a big part of when that planning stage, and of course your implementation, right? Understanding which software you need, this is going to be a big part of it, right? So we want to use a consistent set of tools across all your applications, operating system, your virtual technologies, and storage vendor, right? Has to be consistent, has to be able to use that software, right? So depending on your platform, your database, your storage, your replication, it all has to fit together in that disaster recovery plan, okay? And of course, your software has to be able to utilize that, right? Has to standardize it, okay? And then of course, automate it, right? So it's gonna help you by streamlining your operations. It's gonna centralize the management and automate your disaster recovery plan. And of course, change, right? Don't let your infrastructure get in the way of getting the job done. And this has to be, no matter what infrastructure you have, just make sure that it fits into your disaster recovery plan. Now, obviously, you got to be real careful. Obviously, the best infrastructure may or may not fit into your current disaster recovery plan. So you may have to alter the plan and change as you move into the future, right? So looking at your management of the software, looking at the plan as you move from the old way to do it into the new way to do it, right? Making sure that disaster recovery, adapts, right? Adapts to the current technology and your current infrastructure as it exists in your organization. Okay, so there's a range of available levels. Now, depending on the importance of your data and how much time you can accept for recovery, right, you're going to fit somewhere on this curve. And we're going to show on this curve, we've got a data protection method, right, that you can utilize that's going to get you there. Now, if you're way over here, right, and your data is extremely important and you need to recover extremely quickly, right, obviously you're going to have to do something, around a multiple data center strategy, right, really complex, dedicated, interconnected disaster recovery plan. Right? It gets more and more complex the larger, or the larger the infrastructure is, and or how much time you need it to recover. And if you want it to recover really fast or immediately, right, you're going to have to deploy a strategy that meets that, right? And then you get all the way down to, you have a tape, right? You can delay it. In other words, it can be down for a couple of days while you get that tape from an off-site location and bring it on-site and recover the data and then restart the server, right? That, for most organizations, that is the old way. That is no longer acceptable, right? It's not. You can't have an outage that's down for that long, right? You're going to have to react a little quicker than that. Maybe not multiple data centers. That's pretty expensive, but maybe somewhere in the middle, right? Disk-to-disk copy, something like that. Remote disk mirroring is not too hard, right? And especially from today's perspective, with data connection being as good as it is, right? It's almost a perfect idea to just mirror the data as it comes in, right? And get multiple sites actually running, right? Not too bad. But looking at your requirements and what you need to understand what is that disaster recovery plan and what do you need to deploy, right? And then look at the technology, right? Technologies to get you there. And of course, back in the day, just having a backup vaulting, this was common, right? Very common back in the day. Now we're seeing a whole lot more of this, as we get to the multiple data center strategies is at the top of the tier, of course. Global clustering, synchronous replication, asynchronous replication, right? All of these different application or IT technologies, right? Some of them are fairly new, right? Some of them just make sense, right? Having multiple data centers doing the same thing. However, very, very expensive. Most people don't have that kind of budget, right? So start looking at things, technology can get us there, right? And they're not too bad from a budget perspective. Okay, look at the IT backup architectures, right? Client controlled architecture, centralized backup servers, also very common. And of course, hierarchical, where you have a master server, multiple media servers, and then of course your clients. Okay, when you look at the different types of backup storage, obviously lots of different materials, and of course each one of these are going to have security protocols around them. Everything from the old tape style to a tape drive to a tape library, all the way to the big tape silos. Right, they have most of those have dedicated fire systems as well, fire detection. Right, and then you've got your local disks, right, disk arrays, duplicated disks, and of course network compliance. And then of course cloud computing, right, cloud backup data, right. All these are ways you can get the data, and of course if you have, depending on your strategy, you're going to deploy the correct backup storage type. Okay, so if you back up the tape, advantage is long-term, disadvantage very slow. Right, this is our old traditional style. Right, when you back up the disk, it's fast. Right, you have random input-output access. Right, but it's pretty expensive, especially when you look at those large backup arrays. Okay, when you have a cloud, right, it has site redundancy without vaulting, but it does require your expensive connectivity. Right, and it may not be effective for all backups. And then, of course, you can stage backups, right? And this requires, a disadvantage is that it does require a lot of different media types, and it's very hard to manage. It's very hard to manage. But it does have an advantage of combining those benefits of the different types. So when we look at the recovery time, we got seconds to hours. We got online disk, right? Nearline, a tape library. Offline, you inject the tape. And, of course, offsite is a vault. Right, so depending on where you want your where you want your data and how you want it backed up is going to affect this recovery time. Right? How much time is it going to take? Obviously, a disk, online disk that's already available is the best choice. Offsite, it's going to take a whole lot longer. Here's our final poll for today's presentation. You can go ahead and vote. Thank you, Tiffany.
No problem. To what extent are your IT solutions/strategies proactive versus reactive? And Brian, just want to let you know that you did have some feedback that this information is very good. It's appreciated by one of our viewers.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so we're at 30 seconds. We got 41%. I know we're getting at the top of the hour. We want to close this up very quickly. So let's go ahead and finish the voting and say we were mostly proactive and somewhat proactive of the two voting areas. So very good. Very good. So mostly proactive. You definitely don't want to be reactive. Proactive is the way you want to go, right? I mean, reactive just means that it happened and you're reacting to it. Proactive means you're trying to fix it before it happens. In summary, we want to provide the best solutions for our organization. We want to understand industry trends, right? You're a professional. As an IT professional, we're going to face different challenges, right? Similar challenges, though. And we want to understand what those challenges are so that way we can help solve them. Best practices, understanding what the industry is doing. And, of course, we want to manage the risks of the critical environment, and we want to move from reactive recovery mindset to a proactive continuity and resilience mindset, right? Being resilient is going to make all the difference. Okay, if you're interested in learning more, here's a course that's available through I-Corps and their webinar series. And that was the end. So thank you very much for attending. Have a great day, everyone. Was there any questions, Tiffany?
No questions, Brian. Thank you so much.
Perfect.